Hello, my name is Viktorija Rusinaitė, and I am the head of European Security Program at Vilniaus Institute for Policy Analysis. Today, I'm glad to welcome you here in our online event. Today's topic is Belarus, Russia, Union State, and political military integration of those countries. While Union State project has been there for at least 2 decades, it was at least rhetorically reanimated last year after a new energy dispute broke out between Belarus and Russia. The idea behind can be summarized this way: subsidies for Belarus in exchange for closer integration with Russia. An important question in this context for Lithuania and Poland is, does this also mean a close integration between Belarus and Russia in the military sphere? Concerns about Suwalki gap being one of the defense vulnerabilities of Lithuania, but also Poland, is one issue. But another and more important is, does EU and NATO policy efforts here stand a chance, or is it just another game of diplomacy from Belarus, from which there's nothing to be gained? So in Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis, we turn to Anaïs Marin, with whose work in Belarus, I guess everybody holding the least bit of interest in Belarusian studies is familiar. So the new study titled The Union State of Belarus and Russia, Myths and Realities of Political Military Integration is now accessible on Vilnius Institute webpage. And today we composed this panel from the experienced experts coming from the region, so from Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus, to reflect on this issue as a regional one. So let me introduce the experts today. Anaïs Marin is a political scientist specializing in international relations, Russian and border studies. She's currently conducting research on Russian sharp power and the Center for French Civilization with the University of Warsaw. And since December 2019, she's also an associate fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, London. During her career, she cooperates with several European think tanks, notably the Helsinki-based Finnish Institute of International Affairs, OSU Warsaw, Estonian Center for Eastern Partnership, EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris, and others. And her latest publication, as already mentioned, The Union State of Belarus and Russia, Myths and Realities of Political Military Integration, has just been published by Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis, and of course became a pretext for this meeting. We also have with us today Kamil Kłysiński, who is a senior fellow at the Department for Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova at the Center of Eastern Studies in Warsaw. His areas of expertise are domestic, political, and economic situation in Belarus, as well as Belarusian foreign policy and civil society. Throughout 2013 and 2016, Mr. Kłysiński served as a diplomat at the Polish embassy in Vilnius. So I guess some people in our audience have already met Kamil Kłysiński in person. And Marius Laurinavičius is a senior analyst at Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis. He was previously a fellow at CEPA and Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. His primary focus is Russian hybrid warfare in general, and its kleptocratic dimension in particular. And Denis Melintsov is the coordinator of the Belarus Foreign Policy Program at Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. He specializes in Belarus's foreign policy, Belarus-EU, and Belarus-US relations, international and European security. So for us all here today, this is the opportunity to delve deeper into this issue. I will just remind that the event will take 1 hour. You feel free to ask questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of this page. And let's start with the Anaïs Marin statement. Anaïs, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Victoria, and thank you to VIPA for this opportunity to publish this research, which, as you know, I started already 7 years ago, and which needed an update, obviously, because Russia's foreign policy stance on Belarus has been getting more assertive and conditionality-based than ever before. And we have observed a deterioration of bilateral relations all through last year because of the disagreements on what to do with the Union State. and for failure of turning this organization into a full-fledged supranational organization with prerogatives. We can say that the Union State is remaining a mere platonic union with very few institutional features in many fields, and for many an empty shell. It has been like this for over 20 years already. The paradigm change, which I highlight in the paper, dates back to 2015, following the annexation of Crimea, and has been well documented since then. But in the paper, I asked additional analytical questions related to the military dimension of it. First, how does this evolution affect the Belarusian-Russian military alliance, which was always considered as impermeable to political disputes or trade wars? Second, assuming that Russia cannot afford to lose Belarus, which is its closest, if not its only ally, what might the future hold for Belarus in terms of sovereignty and independence? And third, in case Belarus is one way or another subjugated or absorbed, what are the security implications for neighboring EU and NATO countries? So on this last question, I make some recommendations in the paper on how to help Belarus uphold its resilience and its independence, which I see as a condition for maintaining it as a sovereign state. And given that another scenario, I believe, would mean bad news for European security. Since the first draft of the paper was written earlier this year, there have been domestic developments in Belarus, which give rise to more uncertainties regarding the future of the bilateral relations, which we will hopefully address today. My hypothesis is that integration of the Union State is on hold for now. The strategic alliance is for sure not as tight as it used to be or as NATO policymakers assumed it was. And this, however, does not mean that all is quiet on the northeastern front, far from that. The contribution of the paper is, and probably where it might raise the most eyebrows among my Lithuanian and Polish colleagues, is that it tries to debunk three myths. Myth number one, Belarus is Russia's closest military ally. This, of course, builds on the fact that relations are indeed highly institutionalized. They have joint military doctrine, military cooperation is going on, joint exercises, etc. But under the backdrop of close industrial trade and especially energy interdependency, this builds the image of a functional military alliance. However, over the past years, we witness a strong autonomization of Belarusian foreign policy. Belarus invoked neutrality to avoid siding in Russia's wars with Georgia, with Ukraine since 2014. It took a proactive position in the Ukrainian talks, hosting the negotiations that led to the Minsk agreements. It diversified its foreign policy also, developing relations with China, notably, and in the military field of military cooperation. And it has proven more active also on the European arena, offering to become a net security provider in Europe. This, of course, caused Russia much irritation because as a result of this autonomization, Belarus somehow got considerable benefits in the form notably of the lifting of sanctions since 2016 and a gradual normalization of relations with the West, which of course amounts to tactical flirting, but still is unacceptable for Russia. So disputes with Russia moved from the economic realm to the more sensitive field of political military loyalty. What we can see now is that the level of mistrust between the two is extremely high, and this is spreading shadows also on the security alliance. In the past, Russia was heavily subsidizing Belarus to allow it to fulfill its duties as the guardian of the Union States' western flank. But in recent years, we have seen disputes with the price tag and availability of Russian armaments to fulfill that duty. Armenia, for example, has been getting better prices than Belarus in recent years for buying aircrafts or missile defense. What I argue in the paper is that Russia, in fact, has knowingly let its allies' air defense capacities, notably, to decay in order to coerce it into accepting the opening of a Russian airbase under Russian command on Belarusian territory instead. But Belarus has consistently refused such security outsourcing, so much so for the alliance. Myth number 2, Belarus is already an integral part of the Russian army. This is a widespread assumption among people who consider that basically the Belarusian army is a mere extension of the Russian Western military district. This is fueled by the fact that the Belarusian military has indeed been socialized in a Ruski Mir ideological environment, and for several categories of military personnel have been trained and educated in Russian military academies. However, the relation between the two armies is not equivalent to the one that prevails, for example, in the case of South Ossetia, which signed an agreement in 2015 permitting the full integration of its army into the Russian armed forces. And what we have noticed in recent years, from as far as I know, is that Lukashenko has actually been purging several parts of the army to ensure its loyalty, at least trying to get rid of those who were Russian nationals. At the operational level, military interoperability has been maintained thanks to regular joint exercises, Zapad being the most famous, but far from the only one. And theoretically, this has been upgraded thanks to the establishment of a regional group of forces. What I remind in the paper is that decisions regarding the functioning and command of this group belong to the exclusive competence of the Union State, which, as I explained in the first part of the paper, is failed to develop into a supranational organization. So it means that any decision requires intergovernmental consensus between Putin and Lukashenko. The group is placed under a joint governing body only in wartime, and the agreement specifically mentions wartime for both sides. And as Andrei Porotnikov, who is one of the best experts in Belarus these days on these issues, said, what is considered wartime for one country is not necessarily such for the other. And Belarus, in fact, has been keen on avoiding to be entrapped in someone else's war, as Lukashenko put it. So these cracks in the facade of the military alliance have actually been illustrated and confirmed over the past years. Another caveat when it comes to assessing the level of integration between the two armies concerns territorial presence. The constitution of Belarus forbids the permanent stationing of foreign combat units on its territory, and unlike Armenia, Belarus does not host any Russian military base. It only hosts two military objects for free, based on a lease contract, which, by the way, expires this year. Myth number 3, Belarus is about to lose its sovereignty. This we have been hearing for several years now, and it has been actually instrumental to Lukashenko's dictaplomacy in its bargaining with the West, when it was basically saying, be complacent with my authoritarian wrongdoings, else an isolated Belarus will fall back into Russia's embrace. 4 elements have fueled this narrative and artificially increased the fears of such a scenario. First, Russian ambitions to take over the Belarusian military-industrial complex. Of course, Russian investors are interested in buying the dual companies of this sector, but Lukashenko has resisted calls to privatize or trade off these jewels of his crown. So for now, there is no such integration or absorption. Second, fears appeared, of course, regarding the possibility that after joint military exercises held on Belarusian territory, such as Zapad 2017, Russia would conveniently leave its forces there and use them to launch an attack on Belarus or its NATO neighbors, as actually happened in Georgia and in Ukraine, both in 2008 and 2014. Third, the idea floated last year that the Union State and Belarus could be instrumental to solve Putin's so-called 2024 succession problem, because then he could run again, not as unlimited by the Russian constitution, but as president of a new entity, the Union State of Belarus and Russia. As we know, Putin found another way to stay in place. And fourth, many Belarusians believe that Belarus is already under attack in terms of sovereignty. This is because Russian publicists media and state officials have launched a strong anti-Belarusian propaganda campaign since 2016, advocating the termination of subsidies because Belarus behaved as a parasite, accusing Lukashenko personally of being disloyal, and threatening him that his failure to stop emerging Belarusian nationalism, so-called soft Belarusianization, would expose him to a Ukrainian scenario as the Russians see it, so I quote, a color revolution fomented by the West, leading to civil war, quotes, and the toppling down of Lukashenko, justifying a Russian interference to prevent such chaos. So Belarus, in fact, remains extremely vulnerable to Russian interference, and especially non-linear hybrid measures. And I'm sure Marius will tell us more about this, since he's an expert on this. This is due to the integration of Belarus in the Russian information sphere and to the growing presence of Russian agents of influence on Belarusian territory, thanks to a network which is allegedly coordinated from the Kremlin of foundations, Russian cultural houses, gongos, kwangos, which all contribute to upholding the idea in people's minds, both in Russia and in Belarus, or in the West maybe, that Belarus is part of Ruski Mir and should be held more closely. So in conclusion, I would say that Russia's strategic goal is to subjugate and control Belarus, not to occupy it or incorporate it by force or by ruse, as it did it for Crimea. Although this scenario cannot be excluded a priori. The problem for Belarus is that coercive integration in the Union state is only on the back burner for now. And Russia keeps the upper hand in future negotiations because of unsolved energy disputes and the power of Gazprom diplomacy. Belarus does not have the means of its independence or contestation strategy. One way or another, sooner than later, I'm afraid it will have to pay in kind and accept to concede elements of its sovereignty indeed, such as the deployment of the Russian airbase, which would be only the start of maybe more. Lastly, Russia is an opportunistic power. Should it feel that the situation in Belarus evolves in a way that can be exploited to fulfill its strategic interests faster, at lower costs, or with greater benefits, it will not miss that chance. And actually the COVID-19 crisis and Belarus' looming recession, and now the pre-electoral turmoil that we are witnessing in Belarus, offer Russia a window of opportunity that it might want to exploit. So I think we might hear about deeper integration of the Union state again this year. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anaïs, for your insightful statement. Let's go on now with Denis Melentsov and the assessment from Belarus.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I just read the piece by Anaïs Marin, and I think it is brilliant, actually. Thank you very much, Anaïs. I enjoyed it very much, and I can subscribe to almost everything that Anaïs wrote in this paper. But here I would like to dig a little bit into the history of the Union State project in order to understand perhaps the broader picture and interests behind this project and the evolution of these interests from the both side, from Russia and Belarus. From the very beginning, this was a kind of grand gentleman deal between Mr. Yeltsin, then president of Russia, and Alexander Lukashenko. This deal was about the exchange of strategic partnership or geopolitical loyalty of Belarus towards Russia in exchange of economic support. And it was quite famous policy recommendation paper by Russian Institute of Strategic Studies telling that Belarus's territory and Belarus was critically important for Russia, and to any cost Russia should have Belarus as a political military ally of Russia. Since that, this project of union state or commonwealth between Russia and Belarus started. But after Mr. Putin came to power, he, from the very beginning, started to question this grand deal. And we can now recall, for example, this famous statement from him that we should divide flies and cutlets, мухи, отделить мух от котлет. This meant that a military alliance, there should be military alliance, and economic relations between Belarus and Russia should be market ones. So, and of course, this irritated Alexander Lukashenko. From that time, this is 2002, every couple of years we witnessed the some kind of crisis in Belarus-Russian relations. But all in all, Belarus's interest in this project is to have the common market, and especially common energy market with Russia. And Russia until now is refraining to ensure such market. And in the eyes of Belarusian authorities, in the eyes of official Minsk, this should be the common single market and the equal access to natural resources should be the very foundation, very core of this project of union state. And unless Russia cannot ensure this single market, Belarus feels it's free to let's say find another pillars of integration. And last year we witnessed the most complex crisis in our bilateral relations, which touched also the very different spheres and military sphere as well. And it seems that now Belarus and Russia came to the stage when the very foundations, very basis of our relations should be rethinked, revised. And that's why we are witnessing such harsh rhetorics, both from Moscow side and from Belarus's side. But there are also some evidences that the parties are seeking for some compromise. Let's say the recent information about Russia's succession in the question of loan for Belarus on the atomic power plant. They agreed to postpone the payments and so on and so forth. So that I think, to my mind, there is a possibility of compromise in this sphere. Well, when it comes to, again, strategic environment for Belarus and Russia and connecting to the Union State project, I think there are two very important factors to understand. First of all, the new Cold War between Russia and the West. And Belarus tries here to ensure its own interests, as Anaïs writes also in her paper. And these interests of Belarus and Russia, they are very different, and that's why Belarus choose such quite strange, but still situational neutrality towards Ukrainian conflict, and did not support Moscow in and the Moscow's foreign policy line in general. And the second very important factor, to my mind, is that now Belarus's importance in strategic military terms is decreasing for Russia, as Russia went through quite quite big program of rearmament and modernization of its military forces. And when in mid-90s To the west of Moscow, we have just Belarus's combat-ready some military regiments and Belarus's radar. And now we have quite strong Russia's military and for example, Kaliningrad exclave and Crimea staffed with very modern equipment and armament. Belarus is important for Russia when it comes to defense of core Russia. I mean, Moscow region is less important for Russia, and that's why Russia is trying to ensure that Belarus's military potential is decreasing to place, let's say, military base or to participate more actively in Belarus's military policy. Well, I will stop here perhaps as our time is going too fast. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. Let's continue with Kamil Kłysiński from Oslo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for invitation to be here. After such distinguished experts as Anaïs and Dennis, it's difficult to say something very, very new, very fresh. But I would like to refer to 3 myths which mentioned Anaïs. You started also with a statement that maybe Polish and Lithuanian colleagues will disagree with your article, with your thesis. I'm not sure if I am among those Polish colleagues who should disagree. If I am in this group, maybe I am. I would like to disclaim that the same as Yanis, I agree mainly with a majority of your thesis, of your views in this report. But as usual, everything is in details. We can don't agree. We can dispute some details which could differ, for example, from Polish point of view, from my point of view. So I would like to turn your attention to such details. Referring to your myths, myth number 1: Russia is the closest military ally. Of course, I can agree. I could agree that there are a lot of arguments which show, especially in recent years, that there are cracks on facade, as you said, on facade of a military alliance. But we also should understand that despite maybe less importance of Belarus as military ally, as Denis said, and I could agree, we have also political importance. Russia still needs visibility of military alliance, still needs something to show. The same is if we speak about a political partnership, if you can use this kind of term, between Moscow and Minsk. Russia needs something for keeping its image as an integrator, as a state which dominates on post-Soviet space, at least in relations with some states, the closest space, the closest states, and Belarus is among them. And from the other hand, we also could support these myths if we would try to imagine some alternative scenarios and the possibility, feasibility of this kind of scenarios. Let's imagine that Belarus, being under pressure of Russia and have a lot of challenges, internal, external challenges, and getting less and less from Russia in field of energy, will disconnect alliance in military field with Russia, will turn to China or NATO. Let's imagine. Here we will understand how important a military ally is Belarus for Russia. We could judge on a reaction from Russian side. So this thinking about alternative scenarios are also very helpful to understand that there are not only myths, that it's something in true when we speak about this kind of subjects. Myth number 2. Belarusian army is integrated, let's say fully integrated in Russian army or controlled by Russian headquarters, Russian army. Of course, there are also some cracks on facade. There are some disagreements. There is attempts to be independent, to play own game from Belarusian side. But also, let's imagine that Belarus refuses, out of the blue, refuses to hold a common military exercise next Zapad, or to send your own troops to military exercise in Russia, shield of Union State, which usually are held on territory of Russia. To be honest, I cannot imagine. Let's imagine that Belarus refuses to prolong agreement about two military objects. Because as you said, as you wrote in your paper, it expires this year, but it doesn't mean that it will expire. So I think, of course, it's in my opinion. So far, we can observe some game from Belarusian side that they will wait, will inform you. They are saying now to Moscow, we'll inform you about our decision. This is bargaining, but nothing more, in my opinion. And myth number three, that the Belarus is to lose its sovereignty. Of course, I agree that annexation is the last possible scenario. That problem of 2024 year about succession of Putin will be solved only on base of Russian scenario, internal scenario. We are just about to observe a referendum in Russia, which was postponed from April. It's about this scenario without Belarus. I agree, but at the same paper, you admitted that Russia is imposing some pressure on Belarus, and Belarus is on long-term pressure from Russian side. That it's this is in long term a threat and challenge of Belarusian sovereignty. Nothing is obvious on post-Soviet space, and nothing is maybe very fast without some exceptions. Processes are quite long term, and may be difficult to assess for our analytical work, but sooner or later we can see some changes, and we also see that Russian domination or attempt to dominate Belarus doesn't expire, and it's still there. At the end of my short presentation, I would add my myths, which I would like to debunk regarding Russian-Belarusian relationships. Myth number one, that it's quite well-known myth, that Russia has comprehensive strategy towards Belarus and has very wide, good knowledge, deep knowledge on Belarus. I was also victim of this myth within many years. I was imagining Russian analysts, experts, of course, supported by excellent secret services from Russia, who knows everything, and everyone in Belarus, and everything is elaborated. They have different scenarios for any situation. But if we look at developments between Belarus and Russia, we can see that this Russian strategy is very different, that it varies, and also in many times in very different and very difficult and strange way, despite several circumstances. If Russia would have such effective and comprehensive strategy, we shouldn't organize seminar now about future of domination or lack of domination, about future of Belarusian independence. We would only discuss Belarusian independence as a historical fact, not present and hopefully future fact. Myth number two, that Belarus is under very effective pressure in energy field from Russia. That Russia knows how to use energy instrument in pressure towards Belarus. It's, in my opinion, it's also a myth, because this case of oil, how it was used, this reduction of oil supplies, which we observe since the beginning of this year, it wasn't, to be honest, very effective looking at Russian goals. Of course, it was pressure to force Russian authorities to integrate it, to accept all roadmaps, 41 roadmaps on integration. It didn't happen. Belarus, it's very, of course, difficult. It's very untransparent, but Belarus develops diversification of oil supplies. So effect is just on the contrary, on goals. And myth number 3, and last one, Russia is able to offer good terms of integration. It was said here that the Union State is more or less uphold or failed, even failed program, failed offer of integration. This is empty structure without any real content. We can also observe an effectiveness of Eurasian Economic Union. This is another example that Russian offers of integration are not attractive, and at the same time not effective towards members, which used this their presence in the integration structures only as an opportunity to get subsidies. In case of Belarus, we can see that, but not as a future of a new supranational structure. The common market on energy, also Denise mentioned that. It's very good, very visible example that all attempts from the Russian side to attract members failed, because Russia is not ready to prepare any attractive integrational offer, proposals for members. It gives us opportunity that Belarus still will be subject of this kind of seminars as we have now about sovereignty, about independence. So game is in progress. I will finish at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamil. Let's continue with the statement from Marius Laurinavičius.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I will present a kind of provocative approach to all these things we have discussed, and I will start from saying that we are involved in Lukashenko's game he has been playing for 20 years. So we are discussing all these things at least for 20 years or even more. From the beginning, this union state debate started. He's playing the same game, presenting to the West that he can turn to the West and become a kind of reliable partner for the West. But as nothing happened with the union state between Belarus and Russia, the same we can say about Belarus, well, turning on closer cooperation with European Union or the West as such. So for me, my approach is sometimes based on my vision of Russia, of Russian regime, because it's very dependent. Belarus, not Belarus, but Lukashenko's regime is very much dependent on Russia from the very beginning. And I will pick this statement of Anaïs Marin about Russian agents. And I would dare to say that the main agent of Russia in Belarus is Alexander Lukashenko. So from my point of view, he is really, Moscow has been investing in this regime for many, many years. And Moscow is quite happy about this regime. Yes, they have a lot of disagreements, but generally speaking, and especially from this strategic perspective, Lukashenko regime is almost the ideal scenario for Moscow. Of course, they can. There are forces in Moscow who want to fully integrate Belarus into Russia. But I would say this is not even a majority in Moscow, because of different groups which have different interests. So even now, let's say, when we speak that Russia is putting pressure on Alexander Lukashenko or Belarusian regime, we see that there are very influential groups in Moscow who, at the same time, who support this regime. So it's also about the fact that a Russian regime is not as monolithic as we sometimes think. So I will also pick up the idea of Denis Melentsov about the beginning of this Belarus-Russia Union state. And I will remind you that at the very beginning, at least behind some groups of this, which supported this idea, and Alexander Lukashenko himself, it was idea for Lukashenko to become a leader of this union state. And as the possibility to become a leader of this union state vanished, Lukashenko just lost an interest in this union state. So for me, it's a kind of personal autonomy. We have dependency, very high dependency of Belarus on Russia. At the same time, we have quite a big autonomy for Lukashenko, personal autonomy. So it's what I want to say is sometimes when we say that something is in Belarus' interest, I would reformulate like something is in personal interest of Lukashenko. It's not the same. We have this, the leader of the country, which is much more interested in his own interests and his own, status, or in this structure of all structure of Belarus-Russian relations than in Belarus' interest. And yes, integration has been on hold for 20 years. So again, I don't see any major change recently. It's like, yes, it's on hold for 20 years, and yet we see these cracks in the facade for 20 years. But at the same time, we don't see any major movements in any other direction. Yes, now, maybe the one change which is quite important is Belarus' relations with China recently. But when it comes to relations with Russia, I don't see any major changes. And when it comes even into this military integration things, I would say it's much more about trade disputes. We're mentioning trade disputes between Belarus and Russia when we speak about gas, about oil, about all these trade wars. But when it comes to military integration, or even about this bases issue, new bases, Russian military bases in Belarus, it's much more about trade disputes. The thing is that Russia hasn't offered a good price for Lukashenko for these bases. And if they would be interested in these bases, they will find a way to convince Lukashenko. So it's, for me, it's again, it's the same game we are witnessing for almost, or even more than 20 years. and it's Lukashenko interests to show it in this way. So this would be my provocative statement, and we can discuss further.
Thank you, Marius. Does anybody of the panelists want to react now, or let's continue with questions?
If I may, I would like to add something, that nothing changed in the Belarusian-Russian relationships. As I mentioned, because of limitation on time, I didn't want to go into details, but when I mentioned one of my myths, which I would like to debunk, that Russia is ready, is able to use energy instruments to force Belarusian authorities and to achieve its goals, that it's myth. This is very, very big change. Now, when you, for example, look at field of oil supplies for Belarus, in context of tax maneuver, this change of taxation, which is going on in Russia, we can observe that Russia cuts subsidies step by step for Belarus, and at the same time cuts its offer for Belarus and influence, because has less and less to offer to Lukashenko. Of course, maybe one goal, maybe main goal of this strategy towards Belarus was to force Lukashenko to do something, to accept all those roadmaps, to get more subsidies, to restore this shape of subsidizing Belarusian economy. But so far, result is completely different. We can only observe conflict, we can only observe discussion, dispute between Minsk and Moscow, and some efforts on the diversification, even investments which are connected with diversification. And after the end of this tax maneuver, change of taxation of oil in Russia, prices for Russian oil will be the same for Belarus as for other countries. So which arguments, positive arguments, will have Russia, Moscow, to still keep Belarus with this partnership, in this cooperation? This is very, very interesting question. I think it is also good for discussion.
Thank you, Kamil. So
yes,
maybe...
if I may, just one very short comment. First, towards Kamil, and Kamil, when you said that it was very difficult to imagine that Belarus would not to send military troops to Russia, but let's think about military base, and who could imagine that time that Belarus would refuse to have this military base on its own territory. And second, well, let's imagine that Belarus and Lukashenko personally accuses Russia for Ukraine. And this was, well, has been done during the Gordon's interview on Ukrainian TV. So I don't think that this is that impossible for Belarus. And there are, of course, limitations and red lines in our military cooperation with Russia. Let's say Belarus withdraws from Tashkent Treaty Organization and says that it would like to join NATO, or refuse to have military objects on Belarus's territory, or something like that. Of course, yes, but military troops during, military drills, I don't think that this is something not imaginable. And my second comment goes to Marius. I think that we should define very strictly sovereignty and independence. When it comes to independence, of course, in economic terms, Belarus is highly dependent on Russia, on Russia's market, and for example, half of Belarusian export goes to Russia. But when in terms of sovereignty, I think that now Belarus enjoys complete sovereignty from anyone. And sovereignty, well, by its definition, this is ability of power to control territory and take sovereign decisions. And that's why I think we should be very strict and very precise about these definitions. And when it comes to military base, you, Marius, said that this is purely trade disputes between Belarus and Russia. I think that military base for Alexander Lukashenko personally and for Belarus as a state, this is a question of survival. And this is a security question, because full-fledged military base means uncontrolled airport, like in Crimea, in Sevastopol. And Lukashenko pretty well understands the consequences, possible consequences of such uncontrolled territories. And that's why, despite huge pressure from Russia's side, Belarus finally refused to have this military base. And that's why this is not about trading, not about price from Russia in exchange of this base. This is purely about, again, sovereignty and control of this territory. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, well, I agree partially, but from my point of view, as I mentioned, what you describe as sovereignty of Belarus, I would describe as a personal autonomy of Lukashenko. And it's you know, it's very difficult, and when you let's say you mentioned Ukraine and this rhetorical disagreement between Russia and the Ukraine, but let's look at voting of Belarus at UN Security at UN Assembly on Ukraine. You will see that Belarus always voted with Russia. So it's a game Lukashenko has been playing for many years. Yes, for him, for his personal autonomy, it's much more useful to play this game and to be, rhetorically, to be against Russian actions in Ukraine. But when it comes to deeds, it's not so different.
Well, let's speak about deeds. What do you think most important for Ukraine? Some resolution in United Nations, or air fuel that Belarus supplies to Ukraine to refill fighting jets and Ukrainian army, or tanks that in combat in Donbass? And what about joint military projects between Ukraine and Belarus? And again, the exchange of information, strategic and surveillance information, 2014. And again, about United Nations resolutions, Belarus several times said and described why it voted and continues to vote against the country, special country papers that Belarus is against this very instrument used by United Nations. This is not about Ukraine, not about Russia, and not about the coordination of policies between Russia and Belarus. And this was stated very explicitly by Belarusian MFA. And again, I think that deeds and the rhetoric support of the new Ukrainian government after Maidan, and support of Ukraine during the war, and very harsh rhetoric of Alexander Lukashenko against Russia's occupation of Crimea, I think is more important deeds than some resolutions on the United Nations.
Thank you. Anaïs, would you like something to
add? Thank you. Well, I don't know if we have questions from the audience.
We do have some questions from the audience.
Maybe we take them.
Okay. Let me start with one of the questions. I know we have among our audiences journalists, so let me start with the journalistic question. To what extent do you think it is likely that Belarus will become the next Ukraine, swept first by color revolution and then fully or partially territorially appropriated by Russia?
The question is for me?
For everybody. Let's start with you and then continue with Dennis, Kamil, and Marius.
I think the times are pretty much uncertain now. Nobody could predict the annexation of Crimea, right? I predicted it to my students, but it was in 2000 after the Kosovo events. So we don't know, and the situation in Belarus is extremely volatile now. So unfortunately, I don't think it's a relevant question now. It's for journalists, maybe it's interesting because you can have a catchy title on this, but I won't be caught on with these predictions.
Well, I'm the next. Yeah, I don't think that Ukrainian scenario in Belarus is possible, at least for now, for the several reasons. First of all, Belarus has not crossed the red lines that I mentioned previously when it comes to Belarus-Russia military cooperation. And let's remember that Ukraine wanted from the very beginning to join NATO, and in the minds of Russian general staff, I think they saw the loss of Ukraine and some American NATO's military bases in Crimea and in the east of Ukraine. And when it comes to Belarus, I think Belarusian authorities, they are wise enough not to scare Russia too much about possibility of Belarus's joining NATO or placing military American military bases and Fort Trumps near Vitebsk or Mogilev. And the second thing is that Belarus has, according to different and international military experts, has quite strong, relatively strong military army, and that could be quite of course we can't fight a full-fledged war with Russia, but I think that, and as we're joking here in Belarus, we have 40% of our territory covered by forests, and we have some partisan traditions, and Alexander Lukashenko himself several times noted that Chechnya is quite a kindergarten story for Russia could be, and Belarus indeed will defend its independence very severely. Of course, this is a kind of joke, but still there is a truth inside each joke. And for now, I think that there is no need for Russia to impose such type of scenarios here in Belarus, because the strategic interests of Russia are preserved. At least so far here. We have some disputes in military sphere, in economic sphere, in political even sphere, but I think that here Belarusian power, Belarusian authorities are not ready to organize or to take such stupid steps afraid to scare Russia and especially Russian general staff too much.
Kamil?
I would agree with Anaïs. Analysts should be responsible with such difficult issue as prediction of revolutions. So far, I can see only risk of revolution, very, very potential risk of revolution, not any visible hard evidences that we just now we have revolutionary situation. We have only some details, some small signals, some elements of revolutionary situation, but not as a whole picture. The risk is there. Yesterday I read a very good article of Artyom Schreiman, Szutki zakończylis, end of joking, something like that, that maybe that so far people are not ready to confront with security structures, to fight with them on the streets. but maybe there are some risks in very difficult moments of this campaign. Maybe after the refusal of the registration of Babaryka, despite this high number of signatures, it could be a very difficult moment, or maybe after voting, after forged voting. This is about a revolution that so far I can see only risk. About Russia. Despite many suggestions without any evidence from Belarusian, let's say, a security bloc, especially from General Tertel, who is now main controller of Belarusian finances in public and banking sphere, that there are some supervisors of Babaryka and Gazprom and maybe higher. I think that the developments in Belarus now are in favor of Russian interests, because any possible repressions or even crackdown of demonstration, as it was in 2010, it will be the end or very big limitation of dialogue with the West. So far, Russia observes developments in Belarus, and I think that is quite happy, quite pleased with possible deterioration of cooperation with Western partners.
Marius?
Yes, I would agree with Denis and with Kamila as well. I don't see any Russian strategic interest to do something, well, let's say to remove Lukashenko from power in Belarus. I really don't see any Russian strategic interest in that. But on the other hand, especially looking at the situation now in Belarus, and I fully agree that, let's say, a person who has been head of Gazprom bank in Belarus, Mr. Babaryka, is not related to Moscow interests in what's happening now. So it's not his own initiative. It can't be so. But when it comes to why they are doing that, I fully agree with Kamil. This situation plays in the hand of Russian interest. The main interest now for Russia is to stop this flirt of Lukashenko with the West. And they are quite successful in that. So in that case, I fully agree with Kamil.
It's now 12 o'clock. Is everybody in the panel okay to continue 10 more minutes?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Great. So let's then continue with the questions from the audience. There is quite a long question in Q&A tab, but I will shorten it. Would you agree that despite all the discussion, there is no prospects for transformation of Belarus? Can presidential elections in Belarus and relations around them become a game changer? So let's start with the same order. Anaïs, Denis, Kamil, Marius.
Well, elections have been taking place in the same way for the past 24 years, so I don't think there can be any change when it comes to the way elections are administered and the intentions of Lukashenko to be re-elected. I don't see any electoral change, democratic change coming through elections in this system. This said, we all witness in past weeks that several things are changing in Belarus in sociological terms. The society is changing. The nomenclatura is somehow disoriented also, and wondering what will happen next. So against this backdrop, I think that even if Lukashenko is re-elected this time, it will not be very elegant. It will not be an elegant victory. It will be under the backdrop of a spiral of violence that is already taking place. And I don't believe it's possible without electoral manipulation again. So probably it's his last re-election if it happens. But again, we don't know. Nobody could predict electoral revolutions. I don't like the term color revolutions, but really electoral revolutions in the past, and how far are people ready to go? As Artyom Shaiman underlined in this very good paper from yesterday, that indeed some of them who were not politicized, the critical mass of Belarusian people were considered as apathetic and impossible to mobilize politically and hit to the street because of well understood risks for their own safety. But now the new generation of people who have been arrested in recent weeks, and we're talking about several hundreds, detained and fined, they, including in the regions, they were not used, they didn't live through 2010. It's not necessarily the same people. It's not the traditional opposition. It's just people who happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time and got extremely shocked by the level of violence that is and arbitrariness that is used against them. And these people, and among them are young people who are just fed up of seeing the same old face on TV every day for 25 years, might be ready to basically to hit a policeman, and that would be a premiere, basically in Belarus. And from there, we don't know what can happen. And I agree with the other speakers that Russia would not even have to use much provocations for things to eventually explode. The situation is pretty tense now.
Well, this is again the question of definition. What we mean by transformation of Belarus. When it comes to political transformation and transformation of political regime, I don't think it's a question of the nearest time, and not just because of the fact that we do not see some cracks inside the government or in broader sense in political elites, but also in terms of people's demand. As we take the recent publicly available sociological studies, Belarusian population in general is not interested in democracy and human rights in the Western understanding of these terms. When it comes to market economy, the majority of Belarusians is in favor of that. And it is also not true to say that Belarusian government sat still and did nothing for the past 10 or 5 years. There have been some minor reforms in economic sector, in finance sector, in taxation, and let's take, for example, doing business monitoring and ratings. And Belarus also showed quite good results. But when it comes to full-fledged economic reforms, I also I have doubts about that, because I think personally Alexander Lukashenko is not in favor of complete Belarusian transformation into market economy. But the situation, and such unique bad situation in Belarusian economy after the gas and oil conflict with Russia and COVID pandemic, is such that it could be a pressing issue for Belarus to transform. It is difficult to predict the grade of this transformation, but I think that now this is not about the political will of one or 2-3 persons to transform Belarus economically. This is a means of survival of even political regime here in Belarus. And that's why I'm quite optimistic about the economic transformation, but pessimistic about the democracy transformation of authoritarian regime in Belarus.
Authoritarian systems, authoritarian regimes usually are not able to reform themselves from inside, use their instruments. They are not interested in that. They could only do some minor reforms, which we observed in economy within last years, some very, very fragmental, partial reforms, changes, and maybe something for only for visibility, for PR, just as a signals of will to do some reforms. But despite the fact, which is obvious for me, that Lukashenko will be re-elected in these elections, but not maybe basing on real support from citizens, but but based on let's say power of state, very generally speaking. Despite this fact, despite this victory, Alexander Lukashenko will pay very high price of this another victory, because social moods will not change after these elections, after 9th of August. That still will the very big group of society which is really unhappy with authorities, with their policy, with this system, and with Alexander Lukashenko personally. It will be a challenge. And this factor, authorities should also take into account in several next years. So far, we can only hear very general statements about changes in Belarusian constitution. Alexander Lukashenko also claims that it should be done, but we don't know what exactly she has in his mind. Something should be changed. Maybe just to remind the beginning of electoral campaign in Belarus, when the repressions were quite low, and when Mr. Babaryka was not so touched by repressions, Mr. Tsikhanouski was the main goal of Belarusian security forces. I remember in May, let's say in May, just the very beginning of campaign. At that time, I thought that Mr. Babaryka and his presence in campaign maybe will be tolerated, accepted by Lukashenko as some offer for middle class in Belarus, which anyway is not in favor of Lukashenko, but something should be offered also for them, some representation. Of course, now when Babaryka is also in jail and he has so big support, maybe it's not very up to date theory or interpretation of his presence in this campaign. But anyway, sooner or later, Alexander Lukashenko should understand that that this very big and bigger group of society, which is not happy with authorities, also should find a place in a state, maybe in some representation in parliament, which is not completely excluded. But of course, after successful re-election of Lukashenko, which is the main goal of him since the very beginning of his power in Belarus.
Well, I also don't see any game changer, but I agree that there are challenges for the regime, and the main challenge is to adapt to the new situation. I mean, we have several aspects of new situation. There are something new from the Russian side, and the regime should adapt to this. I agree that there are changes in the society inside Belarus. The regime should adapt to this. And having all in mind, the main challenge is for the regime to adapt to this situation, not to transform. I fully agree with Kamil that authoritarian regimes are not, first of all, they are not interested in transforming, because any transformation of authoritarian regime poses a risk for the regime as such. So I don't foresee any transformation of the regime, but I would look for the attempts of the regime to adapt to the current situation. And of course, it's a challenge, but I don't see any game changer.
Thank you, Marius. Thank you, everybody. I think we're out of time. Thank you for participating in this. I guess we could discuss for a couple more hours at least to cover all the questions that were posed both in the paper, but also that are interesting today in the context of the election. Vilnius Institute for Policy Analysis was honored to host you here today. So thank you again, and we're hoping to see you in our other events. I will just mention that the event was recorded, so I will be definitely replaying it to get more of what you were saying. We will post it online in our social networks, I think in a day or two. So feel free to download and listen. Thank you again, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.